Hello, my curious cats, and welcome back to another episode of the Say Psychology podcast, the podcast for all the info on psychology's most questionable history. I'm your host, Leslie Lopez, PhD student and psychology nerd. So, how are you guys? It's been a while, but I'm back. Life's just been a little bit hectic lately. I know I say this like every single episode, but I promise you, life has been hectic, but things are starting to settle down. There's a little bit of stability in my life now, at least coming towards my way. So let's hope that stays that way for a little bit so I can keep up with you guys. But how are you guys doing? I know life just in general can be crazy for everybody, especially when you go online or when you read the news or you watch and you're just like, what is going on in the world right now? Oh my gosh, like times are just so tough right now, and there's only so much we can do or say to stay positive as possible, right? I mean, I don't want to get too political on here, but two things that I will always be very adamant about are one, fuck ICE, and two, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Also, it's fuck the government and fuck the patriarchy, but that's for another story. Sometimes it just feels impossible to focus on the everyday, knowing that what's out there is just so detrimental, right? I mean, sometimes it just feels like my brain is split into two because there's so much going on at once and I don't know where to give my anxiety the power to focus on. Well, speaking of split brain, today we're learning about Dr. Roger Welcott Sperry, a man known for his interesting research on, you guessed it, split brains. So, if you're a little bit insane in the membrane like me, get cozy tozy and let's jump into it. Roger Sperry was born August 20th, 1913, a Leo, which is kind of fitting because we are in Leo season. But what do we know about Leos? They're pretty self-absorbed, love attention, and have great hair, like unbelievably great hair. According to pictures of Roger, I don't know if that last one applies, but nonetheless, he's a Leo. Was a Leo. But he came from a middle-class home in Connecticut. Growing up, it was a pretty well-rounded childhood, nothing too special. He did earn himself a basketball scholarship to Oberlin College in Ohio when he was 18. So, pretty standard student-athlete, college scholarship, what have ya. In college, he originally went in with an English major, but after taking one Intro to Psych elective course, he fell absolutely in love, particularly with the brain and its anatomy, and he never looked back. Honestly, yes, I love that for him because, I'll be honest, when I first started community college, I originally went in thinking that criminal justice was my thing and no one was going to tell me otherwise. Then I took an Intro to Psych course and I absolutely fell in love. I ended up double majoring in criminal justice and psychology because I still love learning and working with the legal system, just more on the psych route. But in the long run, I realized that I was more in love with psychology than I was the law, clearly. Roger, though, he was a smart cookie from the very get-go. See, his psychology professor was handicapped, and he had trouble getting himself around campus. So Roger thought this was the perfect opportunity to network. Roger offered to drive his professor around, and this included lunch out with his other professor colleagues. This allowed Roger to sit at the table and listen to their intellectual conversations and sometimes even chip in. He ended up sticking with the English degree and received his bachelor's in English in 1935. He did, however, get his master's in psychology in 1937. Then when he went to earn his PhD, he earned it in zoology in 1941. Kind of random, I know, but hey, whatever floats his boat, right? Have you guys ever heard psychology being referred to as a soft science, as in it's not considered a hard science, say like physics, chemistry, or really anything in STEM, which for starters is such bull because it is so not a soft science. In fact, fun fact, kind of really sad fact, psychology was considered a hard science until women took over and men felt emasculated. Fuck the patriarchy! Are we surprised? Can't say I am, but nonetheless, it is infuriating because part of the stigma that goes into people considering it a soft science is that when you tell someone you have a degree in psychology, they think it's just reading minds, talking to people, and reading books. And how hard can gossip and reading be, right? Well, for those who are actually in the field of psychology and make a living from the field, we know that it is far from the truth. Psychology itself is such a broad term for starters because there's so much that goes into it. Counseling, therapy, psychiatry, research, experiments, physiology, biology, etc., etc., etc. Then there are the different branches of psychology: cognitive, behavioral, experimental, forensic, clinical, biology, etc., etc., etc. I could quite literally go on forever because you have to remember that psychology is very much the study of the brain and all of its functions and its components, such as the nervous system, right? And psychology scholars can't study psychology without also studying the brain, its components, and how it works. Like, that makes sense. Like, right? Believe me, I would know. Take Roger here, for example. He had his degrees in psychology, but his specific interest was in his specific brain structures, how they work, and what they're for. His earlier research was specifically on the regeneration of nerve fibers. Over the course of his research, he eventually became interested in brain function and undertook research on animals and eventually humans. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves. We'll get there eventually, but for now, let's learn a little bit more about his earlier research. So yes, Roger was a psychology nerd, but his main interest revolved around the structures of the brain, its components, and their functions. In other words, neurobiology. His interest went as far as landing him a career as a professor of psychobiology at Caltech. Very early on, Roger was fascinated by brain structures, but it wasn't until he landed his role of professor at Caltech that he was able to put his experimental work into practice. In the early 1900s, there was still a lot about the brain that hadn't been discovered, and this meant there was plenty of room for theories, hypotheses, research, experiments, and grants. At the time, it was widely believed that the developing nervous system was a random, unstructured, and blank slate. It was believed by many in the field that the brain's formation was specific to experience, practice, and learning. They weren't completely wrong. I mean, our brains are, in fact, one giant muscle that if we don't exert it, it doesn't grow. So, do your New York Times puzzles. Sperry began performing surgical resections on fish, frogs, salamanders, and rats, all to demonstrate that nerves were guided to re-establish the same connections. In other words, he was aiming to disprove the above theory that the brain was all about practice, and that it was actually kind of mechanical. Right, so where do I even begin? Because Sperry was a guy, that's a word. His interest in specifically physical functions of the brain began at a very early age in his career, as we discussed earlier. As I mentioned, Sperry was interested in learning whether certain actions of the nervous system were learned or just fixed. He started off his curiosity with rats by placing little electrodes to see if he could teach the rat to use its left paw for certain actions and its right paw for other actions. Turns out there's certain motor skills that once we've mastered, our brains just refuse to budge. Kind of like being born right-handed and wanting to forcibly teach your brain to become left-handed. This wasn't enough proof that our brains are automatically hardwired. So Sperry took to working with fish, frogs, and salamanders next. With these little guys, it was a little different. He wanted to see if he could rewire their vision via the brain. Okay, wait, so fun fact about salamanders that some of you guys may already have known, but I didn't. Salamanders have great regeneration power, meaning if you sever certain body parts, they're able to grow them back. What? Mind blown. And also, like, look how cute they are. Oh my god. So Roger demonstrated that individual nerve fibers behave as if each is chemically different from every other, and these chemical differences are matched to certain specific areas of the brain. The result is that an animal whose optic nerves are severed and then allowed to regenerate, the thousands of individual fibers that make up each optic nerve grow back into its respective area of the brain. The salamander is then able to see as if nothing ever happened. This was huge at the time because it proved that no adaptive reorganization of the neural circuits is involved in regeneration. So like with the rat, no amount of retraining makes the connections any different. Needless to say, Roger Sperry was fascinated by the brain structures more than ever, so much so that he decided to extend his research to mammals, as in cats, monkeys, and humans. His newfound interest in the brain was specifically to the region called the corpus callosum, the largest tract of neurons in the brain that connects the two hemispheres, the left and the right. The corpus callosum's always been there. But obviously, in the mid-1900s, its functions were not entirely known. In comes Roger Sperry. Past neurological research had shown that humans with perfectly intact corpus callosum did not show any significant difference in function from humans with severed or split callosums, even though their hemispheres could not communicate with each other due to the severing or the splitting of the corpus callosum. Something told Sperry that there should be major consequences from cutting the brain structure, as the corpus callosum connected the two hemispheres of the brain, as in like it was the largest and therefore must have a much more important function than they knew thus far. So he began designing experiments to document the effects of a severed or split corpus callosum. At the time, it was known that each hemisphere, the left and the right, is responsible for movement and vision of the opposite side of the body. So our left hemisphere controls our right side of the body, including eyes and limbs, and vice versa. With this information, Sperry designed experiments in which he could carefully monitor what each eye saw and therefore what information is going into each hemisphere. He started off with split brain cats. Didn't want to scare the masses too early. Sperry took the cats and performed brain surgery on them, in which he carefully and safely cut the corpus callosum, and once they'd heal, he had them perform some task that involved their vision and response to visual stimuli. He put an eye patch on one of the cat's eyes and presented two different blocks. Each block had either a circle or a cross on it. He then put food under one of the blocks and conditioned the cats to know that when they saw the block with the right eye, the food was under the block with the circle, and when they saw the block with the left eye, the food was under the block with the cross. Are you following along here? You guys are smart. I know you got this. When Sperry removed the eye patch and the cats could see with both eyes again, he performed the same experiment with the same food and the same blocks. Sperry noted that when the cats could see with both eyes, they hesitated and chose both blocks almost equally. The right eye connects to the left hemisphere and the left eye connects to the right hemisphere. He suspected that since he cut the corpus callosum, the hemispheres could no longer communicate with each other. Therefore, he concluded that the cats remembered two different scenarios with two different hemispheres, meaning they technically had two different brains, because with a severed corpus callosum, the left and the right could not communicate and therefore acted as if the other one didn't even exist. Sperry's mind was blown, so much so that he decided that he needed to perform a similar experiment with monkeys. With the monkeys, he also performed brain surgery to sever their corpus callosum. He wanted to see if the hemispheres could operate at the same time, even though they were not connected. So essentially the exact same experiment as with the cats, but without the eye patch. With the monkeys, Sperry concluded that both hemispheres of the brain were learning two different things. He noted that the split brain monkey learned two things in the same time it would take a normal monkey to learn one, which supported the assumption that the left and right hemispheres were not communicating with each other when they were split, but rather were acting as a single brain. Being the curious cat that he was, no pun intended, Sperry moved on to human volunteer subjects. Now, obviously, he was not going to perform brain surgery on humans to sever their corpus callosum. Thank God. His human subjects had their corpus callosum severed previously due to outside factors such as like epilepsy. In his human experiment, he asked the participants to look at a white screen with a black dot in the middle. The black dot was the dividing point for the field of view for a person, so the right hemisphere of the brain analyzed everything to the left of the dot and vice versa. Next, he showed the participants a word on one side of the black dot for less than a second and asked them to tell him what they saw. When the participants saw the word with the right eye, the left hemisphere analyzed it and they were able to say what they saw. However, if the participants saw the word with the left eye, it was processed by the right hemisphere and they could not, for the life of them, remember what the word was. Isn't that crazy? So Sperry concluded that the left hemisphere could recognize and articulate language while the right could not. Now, as for the right hemisphere, he asked his participants to draw the object of the word that they saw and remembered when testing the left hemisphere. So if the word was cat, they were asked to draw a cat. Most people could draw the picture of the word they saw and recognize it. He also noted that if he showed the word to the same visual field twice, then the person would recognize it as the word they saw, but if he showed it to different visual fields, then the participants would not know they saw the word before. So not just object recognition, but also memory. You guys! He concluded that the left hemisphere was responsible not only for articulating language, but also for understanding and remembering it, while the right hemisphere could only recognize words but was not able to articulate them. In a second human experiment with participants with an already split callosum, he gave them each an eye patch and showed a word to the eye that didn't have an eye patch. Then he had them switch the eye patch. He found that split brain people could only remember the word they saw with their right eye. Next, he showed each participant two different objects, one to their left eye and one to the right eye, then asked them to draw what they saw. Every single participant drew what they saw with their left eye and described what they saw with their right eye. Are you guys hearing this? This is so crazy to think about. The human brain is just so powerful. I can't even comprehend it to the fullest. I can't imagine what Sperry was thinking, was feeling. I just know he was freaking out. What's even crazier is that at the time that Sperry was conducting his split brain experiments on human subjects, multiple scientists were studying brain lateralations. The idea that one hemisphere of the brain, left or right, either or, is better at performing some functions than the other hemisphere, that's brain lateralations. However, researchers didn't know which task each side of the brain was responsible for, or if each hemisphere acted independently from the other. Sperry went on to prove these suspicions, and as we just saw, he proved that when the corpus callosum is severed, the hemispheres of the brain function separately as two different brains and did not acknowledge the existence of the other hemisphere. He went on to further conclude that in individuals with a severed corpus callosum, although there were no apparent signs of disability, the hemispheres did not communicate, so it compromised the full function of the brain. These findings led to Roger Sperry receiving the 1981 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his split brain research. Again, because it's so incredible. Sperry discovered that the left hemisphere of the brain was responsible for language understanding and articulation, while the right hemisphere could recognize a word but not articulate it. Well, my curious cats, thank you so much for coming along on this crazy ride of this interesting episode. A little bit different than our typical episodes because usually it's an evil scientist, whereas Sperry, he was amazing. His discoveries absolutely revolutionized the field of science and psychology and psychiatry. I hope you learned a lot, something new, and a lot of something's new. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think of Dr. Roger Sperry. Please remember to follow, like, subscribe, and share on YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, and Apple Podcasts. As always, citations will be in the description if you want to check those out. Stay safe, stay blessed, and stay psyched. I love you. Bye.